Hello and welcome to the Effective Literacy Podcast. I am Victoria.
And I'm Anna.
And we are excited to have you with us today. If you've been listening to our previous episodes, you know that Anna and I are educators who share a passion for reading and all things literacy. We know that literacy opens doors to reading and language skills through that meaningful engagement. We've recently noticed an escalation of research and opinions around what are the best practices when it comes to reading instruction, specifically the role of phonics in reading instruction. To better understand the newest research, we are interviewing experts from across the nation with extensive knowledge in literacy and multilingual education to discuss how to support our students, and specifically our multilingual learners, in becoming literate individuals by the time they graduate from our educational system.
We are excited today to welcome Mr. David Rogers to the podcast. David Rogers is a former executive director for dual language education and is the current conference organizer for La Cosecha Dual Language Conferences. Before his current role, he served as an elementary and middle school dual language educator responsible for content, instruction, and the development of literacy through two languages, Spanish and English. He was a bilingual program coordinator and a site principal. David is an advocate for culturally and linguistically diverse communities. David, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you both. It's an honor to be here.
So we are really excited to hear your perspective today. As Victoria said previously, we are using the podcast as a platform to hear from experts and educators from across the nation. And you definitely have the expertise and the experience that is going to help us to make meaning of all of this new research and opinions out there. So in your opinion and in your experience in dual language programs, what does effective literacy instruction look like and sound like, specifically for our multilingual learners?
Yeah, I would say that what effective literacy looks like is anything that we can do to engage students so they can appreciate the written word and understand its power and that it can give them so that they can express themselves, their opinions, and look at the world in a critical way. And that's super, super important for multilingual learners. And I would also say most of our multilingual learners are second language learners at some point as well. So they come to us at school with a certain level of vocabulary and language experience in a mother tongue, and there's a second language to be learned while they're in school. And so, of course, we refer to our English language learners many times. I much prefer the term multilingual learners. But they come to us and we push them, or we tend, as a community in general, to push them too fast, I would say, and too hard to acquire English, really not taking full advantage of the linguistic repertoire that they already come to us with, the one that's been given to them by their families. And so for me, that's why I've been a dual language educator for most of my 35 years, is I was very blessed to have experiences early on to see what literacy development looks like in two languages, where we build upon the linguistic and the cultural assets that the kids bring with them to the school, rather than asking them to leave it at the door and just focus on English as their second language. So I would say effective literacy, what it looks and sounds like it's where the teacher is purposely structuring their day, their learning experience, their classroom community around activities that motivate the students, that validate what they bring with them, that give them encouragement to explore new content, new language realms, and to do that in their first as well as their second language.
It sounds like a really honoring classroom that you're describing. And earlier, before we started recording, you talked about being a first grade teacher. And so as a former first grade teacher myself, I can really relate to this idea that, even though they're 6, they come to us with a lot of experiences and a lot of language already. And if we can build upon that and honor what it is that they bring, not only are they more enjoyable, but also, we're really creating a culture of belonging in that classroom. And doesn't that feel so much better to learn to read in that kind of an environment versus one that feels less inviting?
And I'll also say that I really appreciate your word choice, David. You said honor the mother tongue, right? It's more than it's a sense of pride. It's we need to make sure that our students realize that their first language is a gift and it's something that we want to celebrate within our classrooms. And, as a secondary educator, like that's so important that we don't let students like just say, oh, that used to be my language, but that it's still my language, that it's still like it's a piece of who I am. And so part of that piece of who our students are, we really want to know how you might recommend schools partner with families, right? And really partner with families to ensure that our students are getting the support that they need for that effective literacy at home.
And I love this question, or the way you framed that. I think in general, we give a lot of lip service also to the importance of families and family engagement in our schools, but I do not think that we do nearly enough. Families showing up for student performances, once every semester, and you give them some hot dogs so they'll come and they don't have to worry about dinner. I mean, that's just not the kind of engagement we're looking at here. And when we talk about effective literacy, it is so important that we engage our families in understanding what children need in order to become good readers, good writers, to become literate in one, two, three more languages, right? They need to understand, especially now, once again in the political environment, they're receiving this message through the science of reading, which is a monolingual English-centric approach to literacy development, that when they're getting bombarded with the messaging that's coming out of schools as they move towards science of reading initiatives like structured literacy, for example, in our state, they're receiving the message too that only English is important. And that is so far from the truth. English is important. Obviously, I work in dual language education. I was a first grade teacher for 7 years in a dual language classroom. We want our kids to reach academic proficiency in English. Of course, if it's their second language, there is a lot that we have to do to support them getting to that point. But we forget to engage our parents, or we forget the research and the experience that we had that says the two most important things kids need to have in order to be successful in school is they need to have a rich vocabulary. That's an indicator of success in school. And they need to understand, they need to be a critical thinker. That's the second big thing. Okay, so how do you get there with that? Well, hopefully families are engaging and spending time with their students all of the time. And they're really exposing them to different experiences, life experiences. And they're doing that in their home language. It doesn't have to be English. When I say that the amount or the size of a student's or a child's vocabulary coming into school will be an indicator of their success in school, that's irregardless of the language. That doesn't mean in English. That means in their mother tongue, in Spanish, in German, in Tewa, in Dene. It doesn't matter. So families really need to understand that. Although they're receiving many messages right now, that there's a science of reading movement, it's all focused on English learning. Parents shouldn't be necessarily seeking out opportunities for their students to engage more in English. They should be focused on their own language, their own heart language, their own mother tongue, and just trying to expose their students to their children to more and more experiences in life where they can develop and they can identify new vocabulary that they want to master. This does the second thing that's really important for that critical thinking piece, is it helps with their sociocultural identity as well. So they get to understand, the more they engage with their parents and their family members, they get to understand who they are in this world. And if there's a little bit of orgullo or pride there, they're also going to get better at presenting themselves to the world. And that's so important for critical thinking, because we know that what they're going to face in school, and this is going to be into the future, is still a Eurocentric, English-centric curriculum and ideals that come from other cultures. So if you want them to be critical thinkers, they need to know who they are in order to compare and contrast that with whatever's being presented to them, whether that's curriculum content or a student in their classroom who comes from another part of the world that has something culturally to offer that is distinct from what they're experiencing. If they don't know who they are, there's no way they're going to arrive at a helpful level of critical thinking ability. engaging parents and making sure that they understand and they value their own language and their own culture, and that they understand that that's their only job or their first job in preparing their children for success in education.
I love this answer, and I love this idea that our students need to understand who they are before they can really engage in that critical thinking, right? That it's like a precursor a little bit. Is that what you said?
That is, you said it better than I did, but that's exactly what I'm saying. If I can give one example of what I heard, I remember that there was some issues happening with some schools we were working with in the Four Corners area of New Mexico, and that was Navajo country, the Navajo Nation. And there was something called Pre-Head Start. It started from birth to 3 years of age. I think it was called Pre-Head Start. And we actually had Dene Navajo instructors going in to the homes of children. So I'm envisioning ogans, right? The traditional home. And actually ESL, English as a Second Language, was part of the curriculum that this person was delivering to this child and their parent in their homes. And I'm thinking to myself, this is ludicrous. I mean, it's like this child doesn't even know who they are yet. And we're forcing upon them the colonizer language right there in the Navajo Nation. Let the child come to understand who they are. Give them 4, 5, 6 years of understanding who they are and developing their language fully and practicing that language through all of their customs and all of their traditions and all of their ceremonies before they're subjected to the English, the English part of the curriculum that's going to be provided to them once they get to school. It's really, really important. And we've seen that time and time again as we continue in my current organization with Dual Language Education in New Mexico to work with Native communities as well. Our parents and our families need to understand that, because they have been sold the idea that somehow English is the only academic language or English is the most important language for success in life. And that's just simply not true.
So, David, you're making me think about different policies that have intentionally prioritized English over other languages. And you touched a little bit, you said structured literacy policy that's happening in New Mexico, and Victoria and I are in California. And a lot of our listeners are from all over the nation. So can you share a little bit more about policy, but more specifically around policy that you know about or that you think is particularly good, not at separating languages, but actually that is helpful for emergent bilingual students when it comes to literacy instruction?
So good policy, I'll have to do some fishing to pull out something that's good in this area. So I'd like to just talk about policy in general, what we're up against, what we've been up against in dual language education for the last 30 plus years, is usually when there's a literacy initiative that comes out through a piece of legislation, like structured literacy, which is our science of reading initiative here in the state. It's monolingual and English centric, right? That's where it started. And here we are in the state of New Mexico, where I would say the vast majority of our policymakers, of our legislators, would say that they are favorable towards bilingual education. They believe this is something that every family should have the opportunity to participate in. And yet they passed unanimously this piece of legislation, excuse me. It is a piece of literature, but it's a piece of legislation that led to an initiative that is just, as of right now, just focused on English literacy development with a strong focus on phonics. It was well-intentioned. It wasn't that they did this to hurt anybody. As we push on the same policymakers and our leadership in our public ed department, they understand that there needs to be more done in order to support teachers and literacy development through Spanish and English, or Dene and English as well. And there's some small things happening, but at this point, it's still pretty much lip service. We're going to get to that. We're going to develop some professional learning that parallels what has been already offered to our kinder through second grade teachers and now is being expanded to third through fifth grade teachers. That has been something called letters training, which aligns with structured literacy. And I'm not saying that is bad, But in the absence of what happens on the Spanish side of literacy development or what happens between the languages, the message that's going out to community is this is the only thing that we value. The English monolingual approach is the only thing that we value. And so that has happened to us for decades. And so there's well-intentioned people that are pushing this through, but we're going to get to the Spanish side, or we're going to get to how biliteracy plays into this eventually. And we're 3 years into this initiative, and our own dual language education in Mexico was asked by our public ed department to put together a biliteracy guidance document that they could then consider for developing professional learning for bilingual teachers. Where there is some good policy, but there's still a horrible disconnect, is in our state we have Spanish language arts standards, for example, K through 12, they're aligned. And we also have an assessment identified that's pretty darn good that is being used to evaluate how well we're doing with our Spanish language development in our bilingual programs. The disconnect, though, still exists, that we still haven't decided if and then how we give students performance in their Spanish language arts side, or even on their content area Spanish language side. How do we give them credit for that in our assessment and accountability system here in the state? Right now, it doesn't count for much, but it should have an equal footing, just like English does. English being such an important language as well. But English is always, of course, the main focus and the language that's focused on when it comes to assessment and accountability. So we've got some policy initiatives that have gone through, and now we've got some guidance for teachers in bilingual programs, Spanish English programs, on what they should be teaching and where kids should be at each grade level. And we have a set of assessments, but those assessments are being done, let's say, not consistently across the board, and there's certainly the results or the data from those assessments is not being used to fully evaluate our programs and their success yet. It's still on the English side where programs are evaluated.
Mm-hmm. So I think, too, what I'm hearing is that when districts or states are prioritizing English and then making the dual piece the second piece, right, that's creating an obstacle for us to continue to advocate for our English learners, to continue to advocate for equality amongst all of our learners. So for those of us that are in the classroom or site admin who might be in a district that have some sort of policy that does create an obstacle, what kinds of steps might we take in order to not necessarily mitigate the policy, because we want to, of course, do our jobs properly. But what can we do if we're in a district or in an area that does have policy that, create obstacles for our multilingual learners?
So they need, those policy initiatives need to focus on our assessment and accountability system. We measure what we treasure, right? And then that's the message that gets out there. One of the things that we can, and there is some policy initiatives that are happening where schools, at least in New Mexico, and I know this is in other parts of the country, are being allowed to, let's say, in 20% of their overall assessment and accountability score that they'll get for the year, they're allowed to choose what assessment or what they want to be what they want to include in that overall assessment. And sometimes schools are choosing like their success with family engagement, for that 20%, or how well they're doing with cultural linguistically responsive education, right? The curriculum that they're developing. I mean, there's a number of things that they're choosing for that, or how well they've done with the bilingual seal, right? Which is, of course, the biliteracy seal. It's a bilingual seal here in our state because we have languages that aren't written in our tribes, and so we call it the bilingual seal. But I mean, so there's things that are so communities are being allowed to weigh in on what they're going to be assessed on. That's a good thing. But I think as far as language equity, and I think one of the things that I did as a principal, and I know other principals do, is every time, whether it's a reporter or a community meeting, and it's all around how well the school is doing, you put forth what you want the community to see, including what your Spanish literacy scores are looking like. And then there are schools that are very, very good at showing how well their literacy development looks across the two languages that they're focused on. we just need as site administrators or teacher leaders at the school sites to do that more. Don't let them decide what they're going to assess you with. You know how our state assessments fall short. I mean, they weren't developed for the kids that we're most concerned about, and yet that's the only thing that often is put out there to show our success. We've got to make sure that we put forth what we want the community to know about in the success of our program.
David, I like what you're uplifting here, right? That you're uplifting that our assessments are really a quality indicator of what we value in our system, right? And that our policy, as you said, might be really well-intentioned and have the right verbiage, but what the assessment that aligns to that policy is kind of that disconnect. And so it's an important piece to think about. And it also reminds me of something Anna and I talk about too, is this idea that as teachers, in some places, we think about our English learners second, right? When we're lesson planning, when we're thinking about the assessment, we do the whole thing and then go, and now how do we support our English learners? And what if we flip that? Right? What if we flipped it and we designed the lesson for our English learners and then said, and what about our monolingual students? Like, how are we making sure, what if we flip that? And so I like that you uplift that with policy and assessment as well.
And I really like the way you said that too. I mean, that would be an incredible exercise for us to put all of our teachers through that have second language learners in their community, whether it's 1% of the population or 30% of the population, right? That would be I think, a great exercise.
Well, we're coming near the end of our time here. And Anna and I have two questions that we like to ask all of our guests, because we believe if we're going to talk about reading, we're going to talk about writing. We need to make sure that as teachers of reading, that we're also reading, and as teachers of writing, that we're also writing. So we want to ask you, what are you currently reading or writing? It can be personal, it can be professional, but what's currently there on your desk, on your nightstand?
Oh, there's nothing on my nightstand. I'm going to be real brutally honest on that. I did pick up a book that I'm going to be reading this summer called 1941, which my understanding is it's sort of a much clearer and much more online history of our Native American populations here in North America, the true story, if you will. So I'm really looking forward to that, because I have learned so much. I've been blessed by being allowed to participate in some of the program development that we have here in this part of the country through our 23 tribes that we have represented in the state. It's sort of like most of the books that I've read are children's books. I didn't have exposure to a lot of children's literature when I was younger, and I wonder if that would have helped my dyslexia, which I am a dyslexic, because I struggled with reading when I was younger. But my four daughters have they've had extensive home libraries thanks to their mom mostly, and I just love reading books with them. My favorite book is called A Mouse Called Junction, and it's actually not easily found. I'm not even sure it's published anymore, but it's just a darling book that was written with great vocabulary, but also at a young person's sort of under comprehension level. And it's about a mouse who lives with a very wealthy mouse family, and decides one day that he wants to escape and find out what's really out there in the world, and goes through a number of challenging, scary experiences. But then at the end of the book decides it's much better to feel life. It's good. It not just it's good, but also it's bad, in order to really feel alive. And all four of my daughters will, to this day, will bring me the book and say, read this to me, even at 14 and 16 years of age. So anyway, it's just a book that I love. And now that I am in my career, just stepping down from the executive director position, I'm hoping there's less technical writing that I have to look at each and every day. And then I can start reading for pleasure again. But it is absolutely crucial. As I remember, one of my mentors, Lucy Calkins from my graduate program at Columbia Teachers College, it is absolutely important that if we want our kids to write, we have to write. If we want our kids to read, we have to read. We have to be models of that. And that's something, I'm writing, I do write daily. Right now, it's really just anything that pops into my head as I'm trying to figure out if there's something of worth that I could be writing for the field. But it's such a therapeutic exercise that I go through each day with that. And I don't know, I'll be sure to contact you if I ever end up putting forth anything of worth that you might want to consider digesting. And I definitely invite you to tell me what you've got out there that I should be reading. So.
Well, David, thank you so much for joining and sharing with us today. And I just want to give a little, props to the reading children's books is absolutely, it counts as reading. The last book I read was Feathers by Jacqueline Woodson, which is a children's book. I read it in like a couple hours, but it's important for us to stay connected to kids' literature, right? Like if we're going to teach students and we want to be relevant, then we probably should read some books so that we can make some recommendations to them as well. So I'm an advocate for adults reading books for kids all the time, and especially ones about animals, because Adventures of Mice are just too much fun. So thank you so much for sharing that with us today, and thank you for listening. We are the Effective Literacy Podcast. For more information to get access to the resources mentioned today, please visit our show notes at multilingualliteracy.org. Make sure to subscribe to our podcast and, of course, tell your friends.